It was one of those lazy Saturday afternoons when the world feels like it's moving in slow motion. The sun spilled through the coffee shop windows, catching the steam curling up from my latte. I'd just settled into my favorite corner table, the one with a perfect view for people watching, when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. Paul. An old classmate from college, always the guy who could recall every embarrassing moment from the past like it had happened yesterday. We hugged, exchanged the usual "so good to see you" lines, and slipped easily into conversation. We were mid-chat, trading updates about life and work, when he casually stirred his coffee and dropped a sentence that made my blood run cold. "I think it's amazing how you and Daniel can make an open relationship work. Takes a lot of trust." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. My smile froze, but my voice didn't betray me. "I'm sorry. What open relationship?" I asked, aiming for curious instead of cornered. Paul looked genuinely puzzled. "Daniel told the whole group about it at the last get-together," he said, like he was confirming the weather. And in that moment, the cozy hum of the cafe faded into static. I laughed, a sharp, practiced laugh that didn't reach my eyes, pretending I was in on the joke. But inside, my heart was pounding, my mind racing. I knew right then this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something else, and I wasn't about to let anyone see me break. I sipped my latte like nothing had happened, letting the warmth slide down my throat even though my insides felt ice cold. The chatter of the cafe was still there, but muffled, like I was underwater. Paul kept talking, something about work, travel, who'd gotten married, but I barely heard him. My mind was locked on one thing: Daniel. My Daniel. The man who, apparently, had been parading around our marriage like some sort of community project. I forced myself to nod and smile, to play along as if this was all old news to me. "Yeah, you know, trust is everything," I said, my voice smooth enough to fool a stranger. But inside, I was mentally rewinding every conversation, every late night, every little moment that suddenly felt tainted. How long had he been telling people this? How many looked at me and thought I'd agreed to it? When Paul finally stood to leave, he hugged me like we were still part of the same innocent world we'd once shared. But I wasn't in that world anymore. I watched him walk away, my fingers tightening around the coffee cup until my knuckles ached. I didn't know exactly what my next move was, but I knew it wouldn't be small. And Daniel? He had no idea a storm had just started brewing. I walked out of that cafe with the sun glaring in my eyes, but it wasn't the brightness that made me squint. It was the anger. Every step toward my car felt heavier, like I was carrying the weight of a truth I hadn't asked for. The worst part wasn't even the lie itself. It was that Daniel had made it public. He turned me into the kind of woman who'd nod along while her husband collected women like hobbies. And apparently I was the last one to know. On the drive home, I kept running his face through my mind, how he'd look when I confronted him. But by the time I hit the third stoplight, I'd changed my mind. No. Confrontation was too easy. Too private. What Paul had given me wasn't just information, it was ammunition. And I'd be damned if I fired it all off in a quiet living room where no one else could hear. I pulled into the driveway with my heart steady now, not racing. This wasn't going to be a screaming match. It was going to be a performance. And if Daniel wanted an audience for his fantasy, I'd make sure he had one when I gave him his reality. When I got home, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Daniel wasn't there. Perfect. I didn't even bother taking off my coat before I went straight for his phone. The passcode? Still the same. He trusted me, or maybe he was just arrogant enough to think I'd never look. Either way, his ego made it easy. The moment I opened his messages, it was like stepping into another version of my life, one I'd never agreed to live. Conversations with women I didn't know, flirty jokes, plans to catch up. And over again, the same nauseating reassurance. "Don't worry, Jade's fine with it. We're open." My name, my marriage, my dignity, used like a hall pass for his cheating. I felt my jaw tighten as I scrolled. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it, something hotter started to rise. Fury. Not the wild, chaotic kind that makes you throw things, but the steady, deliberate kind that plans, calculates, waits. If he wanted to play this game in public, then public is exactly where I'd make my move. I kept scrolling, letting every screenshot stack up in my gallery like a neat little arsenal. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. He hadn't just told one or two people. We were talking about his entire social circle. College friends, colleagues, even women I'd shaken hands with at parties. All of them thought I'd signed some invisible contract to share my husband. And the kicker? He'd made himself the noble, progressive guy who'd found a partner secure enough to let him be free. I could almost hear him saying it, with that smug half-smile he wore when he thought he was the smartest man in the room. The urge to march into wherever he was and burn the whole thing down right then and there was tempting. God, it was tempting. But I didn't move. Not yet. The longer I sat there, the more the anger sharpened into something else. Precision. Because here's the thing. If I blew up now, only he and I would see the wreckage. But if I waited, just long enough, just smart enough, he'd feel the same sting I'd felt in that cafe. Except his would come with an audience, and I'd be the one holding the spotlight. I set the phone down, my fingers surprisingly steady. That's how I knew. This wasn't rage anymore. This was strategy. In my mind, I replayed Paul's face, the casual way he'd dropped that little truth bomb without realizing it was a grenade. I thought of the women in those messages, some probably laughing behind my back, others maybe even pitying me. No. They'd all learn the truth. And they'd see exactly who Daniel really was. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and leaned against the counter. This wasn't just going to be a confrontation, it was going to be an event, something so perfectly timed and executed that people would still be talking about it years from now. I didn't want revenge in whispers. I wanted the kind that echoed. By the time the glass was empty, the skeleton of my plan was already forming. Daniel wanted to play the role of the charming, modern husband in front of his friends? Fine. I'd give him a stage, a crowd, and a night he'd never forget, for all the wrong reasons. The next morning, I found Daniel in the kitchen, humming to himself as he made coffee like the world was perfectly in order. I slipped into the chair across from him, wearing my calmest smile. You know, I said lightly, we haven't had the college gang over in ages. Maybe it's time for a reunion. Here. At our place. His eyes lit up instantly. He loves playing host, especially when there's an opportunity to show off. And with that new promotion at work, he was already halfway drunk on his own self-importance. He agreed before I'd even finished the pitch. Yeah, that's a great idea. We could invite everyone. Paul, the old crew, even some of the new people I've been hanging out with. Exactly what I wanted. Every single person who'd ever heard his little open relationship fairy tale, all under one roof. And he was going to walk right into it, smiling. As soon as he left for work, I pulled out my phone and started sending invitations. My fingers flew over the screen, carefully wording each message to make it sound like this was his night. The perfect host. The perfect husband. The perfect liar. Every ping of a can't wait felt like another step closer to the stage I was building for his grand unmasking. In the days leading up to the party, I played my role flawlessly. I asked him what drinks we should serve, what playlist he wanted, even which appetizers would wow his friends the most. He thought I was being the supportive wife, making his big night shine. In reality, I was laying out the runway for his crash landing. Every nod, every smile, every, "That's a great idea, honey," was another stitch in the net I was weaving beneath him. Meanwhile, I was working on my own preparations. I had the screenshots saved, labeled, and ready for display. I even tested the TV connection so I could project every dirty little text for all to see with the click of a button. And I made sure to invite the women he'd been messaging. Yes, them too. If he wanted to charm them in person, he'd get his chance. Right before I stripped the mask off in front of everyone. The funny thing was, I felt almost calm. Like I was hosting a dinner, not an execution. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you know exactly how the ending will go. and you're the one writing it. The night before the party, I stood in the living room, looking around like a director inspecting a set. The furniture was arranged so the TV would be visible from every corner. The lights were warm, flattering. No one would suspect the storm that was about to roll in. I'd even placed extra chairs near the center, right where Daniel loved to hold court, so all eyes would be on him when it happened. In my bedroom, hanging on the closet door, was the dress I'd chosen. Not too flashy, not too casual, just the kind of thing that made people think, she has it all together. Because that's exactly how I wanted to look when I tore his perfect image to shreds. I rehearsed it in my head, the small talk, the smiles, the timing of the moment when the entire night would turn. Lying in bed, I could hear Daniel in the next room on the phone, laughing with someone, probably one of the women. I didn't even flinch, let him enjoy it. Tomorrow night, he'd find out exactly what open really feels like. The night of the party, the house buzzed with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Daniel was in his element, grinning, shaking hands, pulling people into conversations like the charming host he loved to be. I floated around the room with a glass of wine in hand, greeting old friends, hugging people I hadn't seen in years. But my eyes were locked on the clusters of women who knew his story. They smiled politely at me, some even giving that sympathetic tilt of the head, like they admired my generosity. If only they knew. I started small. A touch on someone's arm here, leaning in a little too close to another there. I could feel Daniel's gaze finding me more and more often. At first, he smiled, probably thinking I was just being playful. But then I caught his expression start to shift. Subtle at first, then more tense, as I laughed a little too long at one friend's joke, my hand lingering on his shoulder. The energy in the room was still light, but between us, a quiet tension was building. I could feel it in the way his eyes followed me, sharp and narrowing. And that was exactly where I wanted him, watching, wondering, waiting for the moment when it would all tip. I let the wine warm my cheeks as I turned my attention to one of Daniel's closest friends, someone I knew he trusted. We were laughing about some ridiculous memory from college when I rested my hand lightly on his arm. He didn't pull away, he just smiled, a little surprised but not exactly uncomfortable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel's head snap in our direction. Perfect. Then came the next move. I leaned in, my lips brushing the friend's ear as I whispered something harmless, but from Daniel's perspective, it could have been anything. His jaw tightened across the room. I could practically hear his thoughts, the gears grinding as the image of his confident, open-minded wife began to crack. Finally, I crossed the invisible line. While Daniel was still watching, I pulled his friend gently toward me and kissed him. Soft, slow, unhurried. The room didn't go silent, but it shifted. Conversations around us faltered, eyes started to turn. And Daniel? He was already moving toward me, his face a mix of shock and fury. Exactly on cue. He reached me in seconds, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the chatter. "What the hell are you doing?" His friends were close enough to hear, and that only made it better. I turned to him with the sweetest, most infuriating smile I could muster. "What? I thought we were open." "Isn't that what you've been telling everyone?" Before he could answer, I slipped the remote from my pocket and aimed it at the TV. The music stopped mid-beat, the screen flickered, and then, there they were. Message after message. "Don't worry, Jade's fine with it. We're open." Every lie, every flirtation, every plan laid bare for the room to see. Gasps broke out. A few women's faces shifted from confusion to fury, realizing they'd been part of his little performance without knowing it. I lifted my glass, my voice steady. "So here's to honesty, freedom, and never having to see your lying face again." I tossed the divorce papers at his chest like a final curtain drop. And then, without waiting for his reaction, I walked out into the night air, feeling lighter than I had in years. By the time I woke up the next morning, the group chat was already in flames. Screenshots of the TV display had made their way through every corner of his friend circle. Some messages were from people apologizing for believing him. Others were from women who'd clearly had their own little arrangements with him, now realizing they'd been sold the same lie. And then there were the best ones, the ones where his so-called friends told him to lose their number. Daniel didn't try to call me, not once. I think even he knew there was nothing left to salvage. His reputation had been gutted overnight. Every smug story, every wink and nod he'd tossed around in those social circles, gone. Now he was just the guy who lied to his wife and got caught in front of everyone. I sipped my coffee at the kitchen table in my new apartment, scrolling through the chaos with the kind of satisfaction you can't fake. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely, unapologetically in control. The legal side was surprisingly easy. I'd prepared for that part long before the party, so when the papers hit his chest, it wasn't just drama. It was a done deal. My assets were protected, the accounts were separated, and my name was no longer tied to his in any way that mattered. Freedom, in black and white. I heard through mutual friends that he tried spinning the story, said I'd lost my mind, that it had all been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But people had seen the messages with their own eyes. You can't put toothpaste back in the tube, and you sure as hell can't erase screenshots from a dozen different phones. His charm had expired, and no amount of smiling was going to buy it back. Meanwhile, my life started to feel lighter. I didn't have to pretend anymore. No more careful smiles to save face, no more swallowing my anger to keep the peace. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely. It was clean. It was mine. And I was already thinking about where I'd go next. 2 weeks later, I was on a beach, the kind of place where the air smells like salt, and the waves erase your footprints before you can even look back. My closest friends were with me, the kind who had seen the whole thing unfold and cheered me on from start to finish. I leaned back in my chair, cocktail in hand, letting the sun soak into my skin like it was washing off the last traces of him. Somewhere, Daniel was probably licking his wounds, trying to rebuild whatever was left of his image. But that was no longer my concern. He'd told people I'd agreed to share him, like my commitment was a bargaining chip he could trade at will. What he didn't realize was that I'd been saving something for myself all along, the right moment to share my truth. As the tide rolled in and laughter drifted from my friends, I felt it deep in my chest. I'd taken back my life. And I wasn't just free, I was finally fully me.